intimidating. Sometimes we can see these experts and wonder, what can I do with all this expertise and these extraordinary people? And I'd just like to offer a few examples of other Law Society members and what they've done. In 2004, we had a lawyer from Orange County. He had a thought. And I'd like to think that that thought in 2004 was inspiration. He reached out to colleagues, religious leaders, and in 2004 organized a religious freedom conference. Jeff Shields had no experience in religious freedom at the time, and 20 years later, that conference in Orange County is still ongoing. Another lawyer has been on the Religious Freedom Committee, but his practice focuses on agriculture and commercial lenders. Michael Fielding has set up a podcast called the Religion Law Quiz Podcast. We recently in Utah had a family law attorney. He saw the need to engage on a Utah religious freedom bill. And unlike other RFRAs in other states, there was not a lot of national news or criticism of this bill. It's because we had Marco Brown and Tanner Bean, who were very important in helping us strike the appropriate balance in that bill. So what does this mean to you? You've heard about family initiatives, constitutional initiatives, and religious liberty initiatives. And in 2013, Elder Holland said that society, faith, family, and freedom were big issues, inextricably linked with the hope and promise of democracy. And they're intertwined, interlinked, and interlocked so tightly that when one of them is struck, the other two are damaged, so that one of them is cut, the two others bleed. Undoubtedly, as you've sat here through this conference for the last 2 days, you've had thoughts or whisperings come to your mind. And I want to remind you what Elder Holland said about members of the society, that you are individually and collectively a very bright light. You're among the finest and best trained we have to defend, advocate, to plead, and to appeal for the great faith, the strong families, and the religious freedom upon which this republic was founded. Please have ears to hear, eyes to see, and willing hands to do. That's my encouragement as you depart this conference, is think about what you all individually can do. With that, I'd like to turn the microphone over to Kristen Clarke, who will introduce our panel.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here today. Before I introduce our panel, I'll introduce our panel first so that you know what I'm asking you to do with your cards. So I will be moderating our religious liberty panel today. My name is Kristen Clarke. I am a non-traditional 2L at the Boyd School of Law here at UNLV. Returned to school after 18 years as a stay-at-home mom. So I feel like a kindergartner in a room full of experts, but I am so happy to be here. Our panelists are Hannah Clayson-Smith, who is the Associate Director of the International Center for Law and Religion Studies. And then we have Athar Haseebullah, who is the Director of the Nevada ACLU. And then we have Elli Roohani, who does work with the Las Vegas Alliance for Religious Freedom. Now, we do have time, I suspect, to address questions from the audience, but we would love it if we could have you write your questions on one of these little white cards so that we can look at them in advance and fit them where they belong in our program. So if you haven't had a chance to do that yet, if you can take a look at those little cards and write a question, and then I'm gonna ask my husband to come around in like 5 or 10 minutes and check with you. Raise your hand. Okay, he'll come around in 5 or 10 minutes and check with you and see if there are any other questions that you would like to add. So, with that, I am going to take my microphone and I'm going to just sit with the panel here and we will get started. Wait. I did have some thoughts to share before we get started. So, something that, as we thought about our title and the things that we wanted to address, I love that Judge Bybee on Thursday night brought up the relationship between rights and duties. Because in our society, we do hear a lot of talk about our rights and what our rights are. But a lot of times people don't enjoy talking about their duties or their responsibilities as much as they do about their rights. And what we would like to talk to you about today is some of the responsibilities and duties that we have to advocate for religious freedom and tolerance if we really do believe in owning that right for ourselves. Something that probably a lot of the people in this room have heard or read before is a statement made by the first president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, when he said, "I am just as ready to die in defending the rights of a Presbyterian, a Baptist, or a good man of any other denomination, for the same principle, which would trample upon the rights of the Latter-day Saints, would trample upon the rights of the Roman Catholics or of any other denomination who may be unpopular and too weak to defend themselves." And Joseph Smith was living at a time when his people and his small religion was suffering as a small religion at the hands of people who didn't understand them. And so it's little wonder that people from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints really do strongly believe that we need to stand for and advocate for the rights not just of ourselves, but of the people around us. So, with that, I will now turn to our panelists. So you'll notice I gave just a very short introduction of our panelists and of their titles. That is because part of the reason we invited them is because they each have some specific experiences and backgrounds that have brought them to this space. So the first thing that I wanted to do was have them tell you a little bit about themselves and what brought them here. So our first question, and I think that we'll start with Elli, is that okay? Is what life experiences inspired you to become involved in the religious liberty or religious tolerance space?
Hello, okay, I just wanted to make sure it was on. Hi everyone, I'm Elli. I needed to start by saying that the first time I told this story, I sobbed through the entire story, and then the last time I told it, I didn't shed a single tear, so let's see how today goes. I am the child of religious refugees who came from Iran, and we landed here in Las Vegas. And so many of you are familiar with the Iranian Revolution that happened in the late 70s, and then the shift from the Shah's regime to the current religious regime that is in Iran. So my family, my parents were Baha'is, which is the largest religious minority in Iran. And it was 1978. My mother had just given birth to my older brother, who died shortly after birth from a congenital heart defect. And when she went for her follow-up appointment, they told her that they believed that she had ovarian cancer, but that they weren't going to be able to treat her because she was a Baha'i. Because the vibe was we would rather she die from cancer as a Baha'i than provide her with treatment. So my parents left Iran illegally. They went to Pakistan and came here to Las Vegas, where my uncle was a heart surgeon. My mom got her treatment here from my uncle's friends who very graciously donated their services. And then my parents went to return to Iran. So they went back to Pakistan and were trying to cross over at the border, and they were told that all their property had been confiscated, all the Baha'is in their community had been killed, and if they were going back, that would be fine, but their name was on the list, which meant that there were already signed execution warrants waiting for them. And so my parents said, thank you, but no thank you. We will be staying right here in Pakistan, which is ultimately where I was born. And I came here to Las Vegas in 1984. I was only 18 months old. I didn't learn that story until I was in 6th grade. I was attending Kenny Gwynn Middle School, for anybody who's here from Las Vegas. And my 6th grade teacher asked us to do a school project on our families and our history. And one of the things she asked us to do is to bring in a photograph of our families from when our parents were young. And I looked around my house and there was not a single photo from before my parents and I came to the United States. So I asked my mom, I remember this afternoon very clearly, I asked my mom, I said, Mom, I have this project, do you have any pictures from you and Dad's wedding? And she said, oh yeah, you know, there's always, for every immigrant family, I feel like there's like a black briefcase that has all of your documents in it. And so she's like, there's a shoebox next to, you know, the black briefcase. And she asked me to bring her the shoebox, which of course I was disobedient, 11 years old, so I didn't. I just sat in the closet and started looking through the photos. And there was beautiful photos of my parents' wedding, my grandmother when she was young and had long hair. And that, at 11 years old, was the first time I saw a photo also of a dead body. It was my dad's best friend that they had killed when my parents were here in the United States getting treatment for my mom. And I remember saying to my mom, what is this? And she said, let me tell you a story of how we got here. And I didn't know. But at that moment, everything clicked. When my parents said America's the best country in the world because its laws protect everyone, that made sense then. When me and my brother would fight and I would say something was unfair and my mom would give the complete non sequitur that don't ever say anything's unfair, America's the most fair country in the world, it made sense then. Because my parents came from a country that took away everything from them because of their faith. So it also inspired me to spend my life in public service because my parents very much instilled in me, this is the community that embraced us. This is the community that raised you. And so you must give back to your community. So you must work in a spirit of service. So the question was, what life experiences brings you into this space? And my response is, knowing that story, how could I not be in this space? How could I not, when this is the country, this is the community that gave me the right to practice my faith and not be persecuted while here, how could I not then fight for other folks to be able to practice their faith in a way that is authentic and true to them and be open-minded about it in the same way that others did for me? And so I'm particularly drawn to the J. Reuben Clarke Society because the person who ultimately helped us get asylum was Senator Harry Reid. He probably, you know, at the risk of getting objection calls for speculation, he probably didn't know a lot about my faith when he stood up and fought for my family. It was very difficult for Baha'is to get asylum at that time. There was not a really long history of documenting of the human rights abuses that occurred in Iran in the early 80s. But he stood up for us, and he said, you have the right to practice your faith in a way that's true to you, as long as you're not hurting anybody else, that's okay. And so I like to live a little bit by his example and what he did for our family. And so that's how I got here. And I appreciate the opportunity to be able to spend the afternoon with you.
And I'll ask a similar question of Athar. Can you describe your background and how you've been involved in advocating for religious liberty or tolerance?
Yeah, absolutely. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm sorry if my P's when I'm speaking sound hard. I've been trying to work on that whenever I have a mic to avoid that. But my name is Athar Haseebullah. I serve as the Executive Director for the American Civil Liberties Union of Nevada. By background, I'm an attorney as well. Not too dissimilar from Elli, I come from a family of immigrants. My family immigrated from Pakistan years before I was born. I grew up right here in southern Nevada in Las Vegas. Right now my office is actually located about a mile away from the elementary school I went to. So I'm as hometown probably as they come. But part of my journey into our work, and I'd say the primary focus of what brought me to doing the work I engage in now is my faith. I'm a practicing Muslim. I grew up Muslim in an observant Muslim household. I'm not probably the best example at all times, as I'm sure many can relate to, but those experiences really drove where I ended up. And part of the reason why was when I was an adolescent, 9/11 had occurred. And when 9/11 had occurred, we went from being a population center that was relatively unknown to hated almost overnight. At my mosque, I probably spoke English amongst the most proficiently at the time, and I was tasked with checking the voicemails on our mosque's phone in the week after 9/11. Now, we had received visits at that point from law enforcement, from the FBI, from other organizations, and we were, everybody's a little confused in the community about what was happening. We weren't up on international affairs in the same way. But what we did hear, what I heard on the voicemails when I was transcribing them, were very serious direct threats. Threats to come to the mosque, kill everybody inside. Voicemails that were left behind saying that whoever was on the other end was going to show up and rape the women inside the building and then burn the building down. And I was pretty confused because right up until 9/11, nobody really understood anything about my faith besides there were certain things I couldn't eat, pork, and certain times I wouldn't be able to eat during Ramadan if I was fasting. That was about the extent of it. After that occurred, after 9/11 occurred, I think for a lot of younger Muslims, we started experiencing firsthand really what the notion of discrimination based on faith looks like, and how government policy often enables that. It sort of spearheaded a lot of the intersectionality of my work, which also focuses on racial justice. Obviously, I'm a racial minority as well, for those who might be in the back that weren't able to tell. But because of that, a lot of these items tended to overlap. I started experiencing weird dualities and complexities in life, which was, I felt a bit unique. On one hand, I would be a standout student, but on the other hand, I was getting stopped by law enforcement without being cited for anything. On one hand, I was receiving community awards for interfaith efforts and making sure that our community was strong. And on the other end, I was being chastised for practicing a faith that certain people found disagreeable and viewed me as a threat. And that became a bit much to balance, but it was what it was. Those experiences drove me to attend Howard University, which is an HBCU for both college and law school, knowing that I wanted to focus on civil rights work and knowing the impact it had had on my religious community here, but nationwide. We started seeing other things, restrictions coming up by government entities on things like zoning. We don't want a mosque here, or we don't want a temple here. We started seeing incidents where, and some of the ones were just jarring. We saw individuals who were sick being attacked because people thought they were Muslims. As Muslims, we didn't even really know how to react to that as sort of being the intended target of specific hate crimes that manifested on other groups. But those issues carried forward. It spearheaded my career. I had started my career as a prosecutor in New York City, in Queens, which is ethnically and the most diverse population in the United States, with the most languages spoken per capita, per square mile, a hodgepodge of different faiths. I knew I didn't like New York. When I moved back to Nevada in 2015, I immediately got active in our interfaith community here again. And through that work, I was able to form a lot of relationships. I took over, have practiced in a few different areas and intersected on public policy, on law. But when I took over the ACLU 3 years ago, I was received with a few different bouts of reactions, right? As someone who's an active practitioner of my faith, some didn't view the organization as necessarily being aligned, but I did. And the reason why is religious liberty has been a core component of what I've pushed, practiced, supported throughout. And part of my work now means that I'm going to advocate for groups, and I do advocate for groups that don't share faith similar to mine. In fact, even when it comes to speech issues and the intersection of two First Amendment rights, the freedom to exercise your religion and the freedom to engage in speech, more often than not, I'll find myself advocating for the rights of those whose views might not be aligned with mine, point blank, period. Because the protection of First Amendment rights at its core is critical. And I understand that if there's content-based restrictions in that manner, more often than not, they're going to find their way to my community as well and to other communities as well. So I view that right as sacred, including a lot of times how people perceive hate speech. That includes Islamophobic speech. I'm not an advocate for that type of speech, but I'm an advocate for the ability for people to engage in that speech, as long as it doesn't exceed the bounds of what the First Amendment has set, right? So that continues to overlap professionally, on a personal level. I still remain active in my religious community, active in interfaith circles. You can imagine that in Southern Nevada, which is a hodgepodge of different faiths, I've had experience working with pretty much every group. Even fun fact, in my personal life, I tend to volunteer a lot, much the same as Elli and everyone else probably in this room. Service is a core component of my faith. And that's why I do the work I do, but it's also why I volunteer kind of around the clock. But my old colleagues at my previous employer, I think probably 75% of the folks that I worked with were Mormon, and I found out about the 10% tithe. And I sure as hell went back to my mosque on a Friday and was like, they're tithing at 10% gross, so we need everybody else to go ahead and ante up. And so that work has carried over not only in the professional world, but also in my personal life in that way.
So Hannah assures me that she's a more familiar face to this crowd, and so I have a slightly different question for her here as we get started. And I just wanted to ask Hannah if you could briefly describe some of your most meaningful experiences advocating for religious liberty and tolerance.
Thank you very much. It's great to be back here with so many friends and familiar faces, and I'm really grateful for the two panelists that are joining me today on this panel. And thank you so much, Kristen, for everything. So I interpreted this question, the most meaningful experiences I've had advocating for religious freedom. There are many, but I wanted to share with you today 4 vignettes of 4 people whose example were really important to me during my time and career in religious freedom. The first one is Dino Ware, and some of you may recall a really wonderful video that the International Center put together many years ago called Making a Difference. And it's still online, and you can find it, and I'd encourage you all to go back and look at it after the conference. But it's basically the story of how one man standing up made a difference in religious liberty law. And Dino Ware was the local counsel for the Hosanna Tabor Church. And he was just a member of the church. He happened to be a lawyer. He was about 3 years out of law school. His kids attended the school, and the EEOC sued their school. And the church turned to him and said, "We need you to help represent us." And he said, "I'm sorry, this is not my specialty. I don't know anything about this, and you need to hire a large law firm." And they said, "I'm sorry, we don't have the money to do that. You're it." And he said, "Okay, well, I'll help you, and I'll do my best." And he was 3 years out of law school. He had a small firm in Michigan, and he took on this case to defend his church. And he realized that it was a really important issue, and he knew he didn't have expertise in it, but he did the best he could, and he researched the issues, and he won summary judgment in the federal district court. They went up to the Sixth Circuit on appeal. He never argued an appellate case before a federal court of appeals, and he lost. On remand in the trial court reversed the previous favorable decision, and he felt defeated. He said, I felt like I was completely broken and I didn't know what to do. My church was losing in court and I was their lawyer. And he said, but I knew that God would help me. And shortly thereafter, a colleague of mine at the Beckett Fund called him up and said, we've been watching your case. It's a really important issue and we want to help you. And I ended up being on the trial team for that case, which was the Hosanna Tabor case. We took it all the way up to the Supreme Court of the United States with Professor Doug Laycock. And this issue that the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals got so wrong turned out to be a unanimous 9-0 opinion in favor of the church. And there are media outlets who call this case the most important church-state decision in 50 years of religious freedom litigation. And if you watch this video, what's so inspiring to me about Dino Ware's story is that he was just a lawyer sitting in the church pews willing to help. And he says in the video, God found me where I was and used me. And I've always just been so inspired by Dino's story, because he didn't know religious freedom law, but he wanted to help his church, and he ended up getting the resources that he needed, and we ultimately together were able to come to a really great outcome. And I just loved that quote of his that said, God found me where I was and used me. And I think that's something that all of us can relate to. So when the opportunity arises, we can stand up and help out. The second story is actually about my husband, who many of you know is just a wonderful human being and also a great lawyer. He's currently the chief legal counsel at Ryan. But at the time of this story that I'm about to tell, he was one of the general counsels and vice presidents for a business unit at Raytheon. And this was in the time frame of about 2013 to 2015. And some of you will remember there were a lot of states at that time that were attempting to pass state RFRAs. And RFRAs are the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And it became a very national issue and got a lot of press because in some of the states, including Indiana, some corporations decided to make very public statements saying that they would stop doing business in the state if those states passed these Religious Freedom Restoration Acts. And some of these corporations made very public statements to the effect of why these RFRAs were bad and why they should not be passed. And of course, I was at the Beckett Fund at the time, and we viewed the state RFRAs as really important and very meaningful to many minority religious groups in states that where minority religious groups were not necessarily respected in their religious freedom. And I certainly saw this when we lived in Texas. If you look at a lot of the state RFRA cases in Texas, for example, it's Native Americans and Muslims and other minority religious groups that are protected by state RFRA decisions. But there was a lot of misunderstanding about state RFRAs at the time, and my husband, who was vice president and general counsel of this business unit at Raytheon, they had a very large presence in Indianapolis, and there were some people within Raytheon who were advocating that Raytheon should make a very public statement against the passage of RFRA in Indiana. Of course, Governor Pence was in favor of the legislation, and other corporations had made very public statements against it. And we talked about it, and John and I came up with a list of reasons of why this issue was so important, but not something that Raytheon should make a public statement about. And he ultimately passed those arguments up to his general counsel, who was his boss, the general counsel of the whole company, and had a really important conversation with him about why Raytheon should just stay out of it. And ultimately, Raytheon decided not to get involved and not make a public statement in Indiana or anywhere else for that matter, and the Indiana state RFRA passed. But I was just so proud of him in that moment. You know, an uncomfortable probably position for him with his boss to stand up for something that wasn't really in his lane. He wasn't a religious freedom lawyer. He was a lawyer over a business unit, but willing to talk to his boss about it and ultimately influence the company's decision not to make a public statement on that issue. The other example I want to share with you is the president of the Southern Baptist Convention Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. And his name is Russell Moore. And I was the lead attorney on a brief that was in support of a Muslim mosque in Basking Ridge, New Jersey. And this mosque had run into a lot of opposition from local neighbors who did not want the mosque to be built. And they were in court, and we at Beckett were putting together a multi-faith coalition to support the Muslim mosque. And I was the lead attorney on the case, and I asked President Russell Moore, at the time, if they would sign on to this brief. And I also asked the Southern Baptist International Mission Board to sign on to the brief as well. Well, they both did without hesitation. Ehrlich and the International Mission Board signed on to the brief. We had a multi-faith coalition of Christians and Jews, and I think even the ACLU was on our brief. And it was a really wonderful brief, and we ultimately were able to convince the court to side with the mosque and allow the building to be built in Basking Ridge. But why this story was so important to me was that after they signed on to the brief, both Russell Moore and the International Mission Board came under very severe criticism from constituents in their Southern Baptist Convention. And there was an annual meeting of the Southern Baptist Convention that happened shortly after they both agreed to sign on to the brief. And from the floor, there were local members severely criticizing the leadership for standing together with this multi-faith coalition in support of this Muslim mosque. And I watched that actually happen, and I read the reporting on it, and it really touched me just deeply how committed these Southern Baptist leaders were to the principle of religious freedom for everyone everywhere, that they would do so at the peril of this very severe criticism that they had to endure from members of their own congregations. And that example to me was a really significant moment in my career. The final story that I want to share with you is Mother Lorraine. She's the Mother Superior at the Little Sisters of the Poor. And I was on Beckett's legal team for the Little Sisters case at the Supreme Court, and because I had clerked there, I was able to get us some tickets, and we ended up on the front row of the seats during the oral argument. And I had been involved in the crafting of the arguments and was listening really intently to the justices' questions and trying to read the tea leaves of how the court might decide and what their questions might mean, and thinking about what we should say in response and all of those things. And out of the corner of my eye, Mother Lorraine was sitting next to me, and I looked down and I saw in her hands was a rosary bead, and she was praying the rosary during the entire oral argument. And I talked to her about it afterwards, and she told me, she said, "Hannah, I'm not a lawyer, I can't make the arguments, but I could pray. I could pray during the oral argument that the justices would understand why this was so important to me and to the sisters in my organization." And I love that story, and I tell it often because I think it shows how there are so many different ways that we all can be involved in this religious freedom area, and first and foremost is prayer.
So this is a question from the audience. So Annie or all of you can answer this, but hopefully at least one. As members of minority religions, how do we balance our desire to be understood and respected for our differences with our desire to join with others to build unity?
Look, I think that there's a few ways of doing that, and part of the reason why I had led in with the notion of what it means to feel the experience of being a religious minority in the United States is tying that into this broader theme of what unity might look like across the country. I was just mentioning a short while ago in a conversation that in this day and age, everything, every issue, every item is viewed as a political item. Items that were never viewed as being political before are now in a politically charged and toxic environment. So my notion and why I came to the ACLU was specifically to focus on civil liberties and civil rights issues, including the right to religious liberty, including protecting the rights of those that are religious minorities. We tend to work in coalition, and I think that's actually more common than uncommon, to have interfaith groups working together to advance a common good. Now, whether that's in a specific sector, whether that's in a specific city or in a state, or whether it's across the country, I think that theme holds through. Much of the work that happens in the state of Nevada, for instance, is done because of interfaith efforts or because of the work of faith-based organizations, point blank period. In Nevada, a lot of our work has been outsourced by government entities to nonprofit organizations. For instance, Catholic Charities here housed the greatest number of folks who were coming over after both the Iraq War and the Afghanistan wars occurred. And that wasn't something that was continuously highlighted. But these were organizations that were assisting individuals who primarily were Muslim. Much the same way in my work as, one of the leaders in the civil rights space statewide, oftentimes that means I'm assisting other religious groups, including my Jewish friends in northern Nevada, when they had a zoning license that was being denied because there was a landlord who thought religious discrimination would be appropriate and a basis to deny the issuance of a license to operate a synagogue there. Or here, as on issues we're currently exploring, we're working with community partners on, including HOA restrictions on the display of a mezuzah outside of one's house, which we think is blatantly unconstitutional. So you have all these groups that come together. Now, what I will say is that I don't know that it's going to be the ratings boom for news media to show a lot of strong interfaith efforts making society better. I don't know that the social media trend will be at the top for those good stories, but in an era, I think, that preys on negativity overall, I think that there's a lot of great work being done, regardless of what the faith groups are and regardless of the types of organizations. In fact, every time I've seen a scenario, for instance, when COVID might have been the best example, when there's a shutdown and you're experiencing things like hunger and poverty, all these communities have come together to really pour into the community. Now, I will say again, that was not a story that was highlighted. We saw news report after news report of what does a shutdown restriction look like? What does an executive order look like? I maybe saw one or two stories during that entire time of the work the interfaith community did to make sure that people were not hungry and that people were not being thrown out of their homes when they couldn't afford it.
Yes. Yes. As members of minority religions, how do we balance our desire to be understood and respected for our differences with our desire to join with others to build unity?
I just wanted to add a brief anecdote here, which is for the last 20 years, I've been involved with the Interfaith Forum, the Interfaith Council of Southern Nevada, in the forums. And every year I've participated in, for all of these years, I've either participated as a panelist or as a moderator. And the takeaway that's so fascinating to me is there's a topic. So the way that the forum works is there's a topic, there's 6 panelists, and everybody gives the perspective of their faith, only speaking as to their faith. And it's like hearing the same story over and over and over and over again. So there's so much more that we have in common, even as minority faiths. And so I try to focus on that commonality. The other sort of thought that came in my mind is that, what does faith look like in action? It looks like kindness. It looks like treating other people with respect out of love for our Creator and His creations. And so if you focus on that, we find this commonality, and then we become allies with one another. And so I know who I can turn to because I am an ally to them, and then they turn around and they are also allies to me. And so that's what I focus on. So I loved Athar's answer, but I think it's important that being a minority faith and wanting to be respected for your differences, we have to start from a place of commonality so that we can have those conversations in a respectful, open-minded way.
I'll just add really shortly. At the International Center for Law and Religion Studies, we like to say that every religion is a minority religion somewhere. LDS are the majority in Utah County, but they're the minority most other places. So I think that all of us and each religion can understand what it's like to be a minority, because somewhere in the world they are a minority. And so when we're in the majority, we need to treat minority religions among us with the same respect that we would want to be treated where we're a minority.
Thank you. We're going to turn to another question here. Hannah, can you describe, speaking of the center, can you describe recent developments in the International Center for Law and Religion Studies? And if you could also tell us about the center's new domestic program.
All right, I have some slides here, and I hope these work. So, Kristen, are they loaded? Yeah? Okay, awesome. Okay, great. So I'm a new associate director at the International Center for Law and Religion Studies at BYU Law School, and I just wanted to sort of do a brief overview of our work and what we do, our mission statement, and then give you a few updates and examples of what we've been doing most recently and some projections for the new year. So our mission statement is reflected up here, and I've added in the arrows some of the ways that we accomplish this mission. So the first part of our mission in securing the blessings of religious freedom for all people is to expand, deepen, and disseminate knowledge and expertise regarding the interrelationship of law and religion. And we do this primarily through publications, through conferences, and through trainings. And I'm going to touch on those a little bit in a minute. The second part of our mission is to facilitate the growth of networks of scholars, experts, and policymakers involved in the field of law and religion. And this is largely through international consortiums that we've helped to create law and religion centers at universities and law schools around the world, through scholars in this area, and of course, cultivating the rising generation and students in this area. And then the last, third part of our mission is contributing to law reform processes and broader implementation of principles of religious freedom worldwide. So we are often asked to evaluate proposed changes to law and policy on religion, and we also sometimes work on amicus briefs in this area. So I'm going to talk about the conferences and publications a little bit later, but I want to talk here about the trainings. We have several programs that involve training government officials in countries around the world, and you can see them listed here. Some of these are countries where law and religion is not very well respected, and so we have been asked to come in and lend our expertise to help train government officials to understand what it means to respect at the very basic level of human rights around the world, law and religion. And we actually have a couple examples listed here. In Indonesia, we've helped develop a master's program in Sharia law and human rights. We also have a Vietnamese religion and the rule of law certificate training program, which we're going to be continuing this summer in July in a rural region of Vietnam, which has had some of the most difficult time with infractions of religious freedom in their area. The next bullet point deals with our program at Oxford University. We have a Young Scholars program on religion and the rule of law, where we're trying to train the next generation of professors and scholars and thinkers on religion and law. So those are some of our trainings. The networks, you'll see up here, we have helped create a variety of different consortiums around the world. The International Consortium, the Latin America Consortium, the African Consortium, the West African Center, and the South Asia Consortium. And all of these consortiums, again, are sort of the hub of networking of scholars and students and practitioners and policymakers on the issue of law and religion. And then I talked briefly about law reform. This is just a list of some of the countries around the world where we have been asked to consult on new provisions or changes or amendments on law and religion. And you can see the list is quite lengthy. So this last year was the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is largely recognized as sort of the most important international legal human rights instrument. And we held a variety of different conferences around the world. The Asian Perspectives on Human Dignity was convened at BYU Hawaii last spring with experts from various countries, Vietnam, China, Korea, all talking about Asian perspectives on human dignity. And why did we choose human dignity? We're talking about religious freedom. Why are you bringing in human dignity? Well, we found that in a lot of countries around the world, it's sometimes hard to talk about religious freedom because of the polarization, because of the politics, because of the issues that complicate that. And so we've tried to sort of step back and talk about what is core to human dignity. What's core to human dignity is recognizing that we're all created in God's image and that we all have this yearning to understand God and to find God in our own way. And so that human dignity component really helps people understand why religious freedom is so important, because you're basically affirming the basic humanity of other people that may not believe the same as you. So the Asian Perspectives book is to be coming out soon. We're finishing the editing on that. The African Perspectives of Human Dignity book is available on Amazon if you're interested in reading it. We have some amazing African scholars who have talked about human dignity in their own cultures and contexts. We have the Islamic Perspectives on Human Dignity coming out soon, and the Children of Abraham. This is a really neat project where we're bringing together Islamic clerics and Jewish rabbis and Christian religious leaders to talk about the children of Abraham and how they view human dignity. Last October, we had the 30th annual symposium at BYU Law School. Many of you have been to this, but it was the largest ever that we've ever convened with scholars and government policy leaders from around the world who came to talk about the 75th anniversary of the UDHR. And then finally, I'll just talk about the domestic program that we started this year. Oh, sorry, forgot to advance the slide. That was the last slide that I just talked about. And then our domestic program was started this last year. Brett Scharfs asked me to head up something called the Religious Freedom Alliance Council, which we traditionally at the center have been very focused on international issues around the world, but oftentimes people don't think about the US being involved in international kinds of things, but we want to include the United States in our international efforts. And so we have been supporting local efforts of folks around the country who want to convene scholars and government leaders and students to talk about religious freedom and why it's so important to defend here at home in the United States. So this is just, we started with about, I think, 8 people last year, and we've almost doubled that this year. I want to give a plug briefly to the Las Vegas Alliance for Religious Freedom and Human Dignity, and I want to thank Martin and Allison Egbert, who are here in the front. They are members of our International Advisory Council, and they have started the Las Vegas Alliance for Religious Freedom and Human Dignity. Last year was their first conference. This year is their second annual conference, and they have a wonderful table over there against the wall with some brochures. Their conference is coming up on April 18th, and they have just a star-studded cast, and you can see some of the posters on your table of wonderful people coming to talk about these issues in Las Vegas and what it means to Nevada. So if you have an interest in being part of our Religious Freedom Alliance Council, several of you are already in the audience today, but we'd love to have you join us so we can support your local efforts to defend religious freedom in the United States. I think that's about it.
Okay, and now Athar, can you describe a recent opportunity you've had to promote religious tolerance and freedom in your work?
Yeah, I can do some of the external and some of the internal. It's externally, ACLU, for those that are not familiar with our work, we're the nation's largest civil liberties and civil rights organizations with millions of members nationwide. We're a federated organization, which means that every affiliate is going to determine its own priorities, how it operates. The overwhelming majority of work that gets done is at the affiliate level. I say affiliate specifically instead of saying state office, because we have a unique twist at the ACLU where California actually has 3 different affiliates: Northern California, Southern California, and San Diego. and Wyoming, North Dakota, and South Dakota share one affiliate, and that's largely driven by the membership size, so that's why we use the model. But within each of these affiliates, we have our own independent structures. We operate independently, but in partnership with our national organization, and that structure generally allows us to accomplish work in 3 ways. One is through community engagement, public education. That means tabling at events, it means speaking and putting on Know Your Rights trainings, things of that nature. It also involves our media work. The second is public policy work, and we'll advocate or lobby. I know lobbying is also a taboo word, but it just means advocate. Sometimes you're paid, sometimes you're not. And we do that at the local levels, the regional level, the state level, and at the federal level. And we engage in impact litigation. And when we say impact litigation, generally if it's not going to change a public policy, we're probably not going to touch it. We would run out of capacity quick. For those that are civil practitioners, you understand the weight that comes with it. It's not quick turnarounds on most of those. So almost in every instance we've gotten involved here in Nevada, at least since I took over a few years ago, the government is on the opposite ends of our cases whenever we're engaged in litigation. Externally, one of the ways that came up and the opportunity to sort of build that understanding was during our most recent legislative session, where we had a multitude of student organizations and families come forward, and they had stated that their kids were effectively being marked absent from school. It might have been an excused absence, but there was no ability to simply just go in and, you know, like for instance, my religious holidays might be a little bit different than what's recognized on a calendar. And the reason why I was coming up, and it's not important to everybody, but it's important to some people, is that students weren't getting a perfect attendance award because they were having to take time off for religious reasons, whether that meant it was because of a religious holiday that wasn't recognized in the same calendar, or it meant simply that they were exceeding a specific number of days, or for students, and this becomes relevant too, dignity doesn't start when you become an adult, it starts at birth. And for these students who are having to get a letter from their parent or their family member that said that they were absent from school for a specific reason, it was almost like they were having to justify the practice of their faith. So a coalition and a group of individuals kind of got together around this issue, and it ended up receiving significant bipartisan support to allow an additional bank, basically, of holidays. To allow students to be able to use those so you wouldn't run into the same types of issues. You wouldn't have to necessarily disclose everything. You wouldn't have to elevate this all the way up. I mean, some of those practices have been in existence for so long that some of the common sense solutions that might come up oftentimes get lost in society, right? So that was an example of an external. Internally, I'll tell you, it's an odd dynamic. I would say 80+% of my team statewide is atheist. We often have conversations about faith. And part of the reason why isn't about, it's not a proselytizing effort on anybody's end, but it helps create understanding internally for what drives our work. It also allows us to figure out where we might lean in and provide a different perspective. In the ACLU universe, we have a multitude of faiths that are represented across the country. But here specifically, it's been very interesting in a state that consistently ranks really high for individual liberty and the individual expression of one's own faith, to have a community that is receptive to most every faith. A lot of times, and what I try to tell people here, and again, this won't come across if I'm doing a news interview, because it won't generate ratings in that same way or generate what we need to, but the reality is that this community overwhelmingly is welcoming and tolerant of other faiths. And from a policy perspective, the poor policies we have in place that we oftentimes attempt to overturn are often not a product of ill intention, but simply because nobody's reviewed anything since it was drafted, and there's only so many people within the state to be able to deal with it. Now, we deal with them on the back end too, and if we run into issues where we might have a disagreement internally about handling a specific issue, and it's because there's an implication of faith involved, we have discourse internally about what that looks like and how do we strike a balance between protecting religious liberty and protecting and advancing civil rights. It's the age-old adage of doing both, and it's not an either or, it is both. You can have both, and in fact you need both, because religious liberty won't exist without civil rights, and civil rights will mean nothing if you don't allow for the exercise of religious liberty in that way.
Thank you. And do you know, actually, I am going to follow up what you just said with one of the questions that I got from the audience, because it goes right along with that. And the question is, which you partially addressed, is there an inherent conflict between religious freedom and religious tolerance and civil liberties?
Yeah, you know, conflict is a strong word, and I think that's the consensus most people would reach. But I would say there's inherent tension. Tension's not always a bad thing. Tension makes society stronger, right? We create diamonds through tension. It doesn't come through no effort. So the more tension we have as a society, it gives our country, our state, our community an opportunity to grow. I often hear this conversation surrounding civility, and I've said this, whenever we're filing a major lawsuit, I will call our attorney general or respective party and give them a heads up. Hey man, so you know in about 15 minutes there's a case dropping, but just want to give you a courtesy heads up, and he'll say thank you, right? But you know, my view is what's a lawsuit between friends, right? And we're all trying to make our society better, and sometimes you have to have a referee in place to be able to come up with those decisions. So as we grapple with those decisions, that tension is a good thing. I think if we didn't have tension historically, we would be where we were 300 plus years ago. But that tension allows for us to evolve societally. It also allows for exposure into different faith groups, right? We have over 3,000 faith groups in the United States. And one of the key aspects I think that ends up existing is any time that there's a case or an issue, a policy issue, or something else that pops up, primarily and including about minority faith, that's not a bad thing. It sheds light and brings interest, attention, and things of that nature to those faiths. You know, and I speak on that as a first-hand example. As I mentioned, there's been most of the coverage of Muslims in America or Muslims worldwide, I would not describe as being particularly favorable or painting us in a favorable light historically. But the attention's important because we're 2 billion people worldwide, and we might have a smaller presence in the United States, but it's important for people to understand what that looks like. So there's many aspects there. There's always going to be tension surrounding religious liberty and surrounding civil rights, and it's important to continue to flesh that out as time progresses and have those types of discussions and dialogues, whether that means it's in public or whether it means it's in court.
And I actually kind of take issue with the dialectic that's been created as religious freedom on the other side of civil rights. Religious liberty is a fundamental human right. It is a fundamental civil right. So, I mean, I think religious identity is one of the most important identities that people can have. And so I think it's actually a false dichotomy when we set up religious freedom on the other side of civil rights, because religious freedom is a civil right. And so it's always about how do we balance the expansion and expression and realization of these different forms of identity that people have that are protected under civil rights law.
I'm going to tie this, I think, into whatever I think is the next question. So I think that as lawyers, we are in a very unique position because we live in the gray. If it's a black or white issue, you know who's going to win or lose. You're typically not going to have a lawsuit. But we live in a state of discomfort. That's where our practices typically are. We are usually called in to fix people's problems. And so we are in a very distinct, unique, special place where we can help bridge that gap and help take away what feels dichotomous. The other thing that I know is I like living in a state of discomfort. I mean, I don't, but I like living in a state of discomfort in the sense that the way that we grow as human beings is by being challenged and having, if we always live in this sort of state of comfort, we don't grow. We don't have the opportunity to grow and challenge the way that we think. And so I think being challenged and learning about other faiths is a huge part of that. And then I think closing the loop on that question is that if you think about your religious beliefs as being your most deeply held beliefs, which is one of the things that is always talked about in the interfaith forums, I didn't choose to be born a woman. I didn't choose to be born in Pakistan. I didn't choose to be born of my parents, but I chose my faith. It's a decision that I made. It's a decision that I make on a daily basis. And so if that is my most deeply held belief, and Athar's belief, also his most deeply held belief, is his faith, and I love my Creator, and I love his creation, how can I not then at least respect his right to believe the way that he believes and be present for him as he believes that way, and him then for me? And so I try to come at it from that perspective. And so yes, it's this religious freedom and human dignity. It's religious freedom so you can have human dignity. It's not one or the other. You can't have human dignity without being able to express what your deeply held beliefs are.
Thank you. Now, Elli, we've heard just a little bit from Hannah about the Las Vegas Alliance for Religious Freedom and Human Dignity, but I know you do work with that organization as well. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So I'll tell you how I came to be a part of the Alliance. Is in 2022, I was moderating an interfaith forum, and Allison and Martin, who are the most beautiful, lovely human beings sitting right here. And they approached me after, and they said, we'd like to get your phone number. We're working on this thing. We'll be in touch. And I said, okay, great, lovely. We meet a lot of people during the forums. And then they called me, and they were telling me about they're a group of like-minded individuals. It's about building religious freedom, protecting religious freedom, but to the end of promoting human dignity, allowing people to practice their faith. And so it was the other side of the interfaith forum coin. So interfaith forums are all about learning, not proselytizing. It's not about tolerance. That word rubs me the wrong way. I tolerate the crazy things my children do. I hate that word. It's about understanding and being respectful, right? That's what we're really building toward. And so I was all about it, because it was the piece that was missing from my interfaith work. It felt nice learning about other people's religions. It felt nice about learning about commonalities, but there was a gap. It's like, okay, now what? Cool, I know a lot about a lot of different religions, but now what? So I became involved that way. And one of the things that Allison would always say, she goes, we're doing this because it's needed. And it doesn't need to be an annual symposium. When it doesn't need to be an annual symposium, we'll stop being an annual symposium. So you've heard, first of all, you have flyers. Everybody should register. It's only $20 if you don't want CLE credit. If you want CLE, it's a little bit more. But an amazing lineup of people who bring different perspectives and who are there to challenge one another so we can all grow together. So it'll be on April 18th. It'll be here on campus. We have the amazing support of the law school, and that's been tremendous for us. But to the extent that Hannah's work is very high level, we're a very grassroots organization, and we are getting off the ground, and we want others who are like-minded to come and join us in being in that uncomfortable gray space so that we can grow together.
Okay, so now this question is for all three of you, so feel free to jump in as you choose. What does community-based lawyering look like from the perspective of a person of faith?
I feel like I went first too many times, so I'm going to go ahead and pivot this and go third this one.
Well, I know many of you sitting in the audience today have participated in amicus briefs or in other ways to support religious liberty cases. I'm also on the J. Reuben Clarke Law Society Religious Freedom Committee. Rob Snyder is the chair. I'm one of the folks over the, Rob, what is it again? I'm just kidding. It's the bringing together local groups and reaching out to other organizations that have like-minded values with us, and also working on the Religious Freedom Award that we give. So through that J. Reuben Clarke Law Society Religious Freedom Committee, we actually have another member of our committee that helps write amicus briefs, so the J. Reuben Clarke Law Society is actually writing amicus briefs now in really important religious freedom cases. So I view that as a form of community-based lawyering, because I think we're getting involved in the issues that we care about as an organization, as the J. Reuben Clarke Law Society, the value of religious freedom and why it's important, and we're getting briefs actually under our name in important cases in this space. So I think that's really an important development for the J. Reuben Clarke Law Society, and I think that's something we need to, be really happy about and grateful about. But I also know that there are many individual lawyers in this room, I could name them, but then I'd forget somebody, so I won't name anybody, but there are a lot of lawyers in this room who have been involved in writing briefs in support of religious freedom cases in a lot of different jurisdictions around the country. So I view that as one of the most important things that this legal society can do, is actively be engaged in religious freedom cases that interest you. I know of a case, for example, in Dallas, where we just moved from, where a friend of mine, Richard Salgado, was involved in representing a black church there when they ran into some issues with their local government, and he was successful in helping this black church win in that case. So I think just the individual initiative of individual lawyers seeing a need like Dino Ware did and just standing up and taking the lead on a brief or on a case is the essence of what it means to advocate for religious freedom in a community-based lawyering perspective. And I'm really, really grateful that the Law Society has championed that cause, both as an organization and encouraged the individual members of its organization to do that.
So I'm interpreting this question a little bit more broadly than just with respect to working on religious freedom. So in my faith, we believe that work that is done in the spirit of service to your fellow man is elevated to that of worship. And so in my daily work, I work at Legal Aid, and I work with survivors of human trafficking. So the people that come to me they've been victimized, they are scrutinized based upon their own actions as part of their victimization. And it's a bit of a rough crowd. And so the perspective that I bring to it as a person of faith, recognizing that they also have their own faith, and I'll be honest with you, the people that I work with are very broken down, and their faith is really, really low when they get to me. And so I think that approaching them with that authenticity of truly caring about them, and with that kindness that I would hope somebody would show me on my darkest days, is part of it. And the other is something that my mom taught me. She says, there's a reason that we give babies milk and not steak. And she said, you have to meet people where they are based upon their capacity. In the same way that we don't give babies steak because they can't digest it, there's a time and a place that we approach folks in their journeys. And so that's another huge part of this community-based lawyering as a person of faith. And look, in my work, I don't get to talk about faith a lot, but sometimes I will say, I don't know if you believe in God. I don't know if you have a religion, but by the way, we have these community organizations who can help you. Or this is what helps get me through the day. And I want you to think about that and reflect on it. It doesn't matter if it doesn't resonate with you. There might be something I say that resonates with you. So I wanted to look at it a little bit more broadly, because I think that even in our day-to-day interactions with our clients, any of you are civil litigators, you can imagine that maybe faith doesn't come up, but you are still providing a service to somebody who needs it. And I think if we bring that spirit of service to our work, I think that also furthers our missions.
Yeah, I'd just add on, I think those are both right on the money. The one contribution I'd give is that from the perspective of a person of faith, community-based lawyering can really come in two ways. It can come through structured service and support, or unstructured service and support. So I'll give a couple examples of what that looks like. We oftentimes reach out to law firms when we're working on religious liberty issues, and I can give a couple different examples of how that might play out. We have a case right now that will need to be filed in the next few months of a religious woman who was being evicted from her home and asked for access to her headscarf more than a dozen times and was denied access. because the specific entity that was removing her from the home doesn't have a policy or procedure in place, subjecting them potentially to Monell-related liability there, but it gives an opportunity to create a mechanism in practice there. Simultaneously, the issue I mentioned with respect to mezuzahs being prohibited by certain HOAs. We think it's deeply unconstitutional. And so for those types of issues that come up, we encourage you, reach out to organizations, whether it's the ACLU or another one. I'm specifically plugging the ACLU because I know we have a couple that are ready to go right now if there's people that want to do that kind of work here in Nevada and really weigh in and lean in on these deep constitutional issues, support community and the rights of those to have their religious freedom and liberty at the forefront. The second way that I'll mention that community-based lawyering shows up is probably the more common way, which is a bit of a more unstructured way. It means that each of us who are lawyers are serving within either our own religious community or another religious community in a way that might not be structured. It might not be a formal program that exists. It might be something as simple as reaching out to your specific church or your mosque or synagogue, temple, and saying, hey, I want to host a Know Your Rights training, or I want to host an estate planning workshop. I'm going to volunteer for 2 days, and I'm going to do it within our religious community here because our religious community, people don't have their will set up. Seniors haven't done that yet. Or we haven't had the opportunity to do an Ask a Lawyer session, and folks can't afford an attorney. And these are the same people that we see once a week at religious services, but they don't have the ability to have an hour conversation with us based on financial means thereafter. So that unstructured way becomes really important on a day-to-day level because structure doesn't always yield results in the way sometimes, as we all know, sometimes unstructured approaches do. But the thing that might emanate from there too is you might inspire someone who's, and I think we all deal with this as people of faith. I don't know one religious institution right now that elders, I guess I could say, or people who have been around for a while, and I mean that in the age sense, are not saying that, hey, we're seeing less and less young people showing up. We're seeing fewer people who are youth that are sticking around after they're 18 once their parents stop bringing them around. But I think one of the things that happens is when you start introducing concepts like, I'm going to host a legal workshop or a Know Your Rights training, something in the evening, you start to inspire a younger generation to also figure out what they might be able to do as lawyers, how they might be able to give back to their community. And for as much negativity that exists surrounding lawyers and the legal profession, almost always when someone has that direct encounter with you, should end up being a positive result that might end up inspiring them to continue to participate in that service, and it makes all of our communities more vibrant as a result. Okay, I'm going to address this question to all three of you as well. What tools can an individual, we're going to dial down even more, what tools can an individual practitioner use to increase community support for his or her religious liberty or human dignity work?
I'll go first on that one. And they'll fix my answer if inevitably I mess up. But so from a tools perspective, there's a lot of tools out there. Obviously outside of like research tools, and whether that means it's through university, whether that means it's through a civil rights organization and understanding how to do some of that work, or participating in CLEs. I think those are all good tools to get there. But the really the largest tool I feel like folks have right now is instant communication, and that's a tool that's on demand. We have the ability to contact someone to figure out what the issue that someone's struggling might look like if resolved, but it also gives us the ability to connect with other people to create momentum behind the work. The reason why we focus on strategic impact litigation at the ACLU and not just litigation is because if it's not going to hit at scale, we're going to run into the issue 2 weeks later or a month later. It was something I experienced. I used to be a staff attorney at Legal Aid as well, and the sheer volume almost was unfathomable. I was there around 4 years, hundreds of cases at a time. You start running into the same issue. From my end, part of the reason why I went to the ACLU and was able to, be grateful for the opportunity to do the work and build this team is because we focus on impact litigation. And when we're trying to deal with that, communication really becomes key. It allows you to organize communities and get them to pay attention to legal issues. Really, faith-based organizing is one of the most powerful tools that exists across the country, and lawyers don't make enough use of it overall and in general, whether that means gaining insight into specific areas or getting your community to care about those issues. Faith-based groups are, I would say, number one. We're already set up to be organized in that fashion. We just don't get oftentimes a lot of lawyers that are presenting on things. How often do any of us actually put those types of forums on in our religious institutions or those workshops on to give people that opportunity and preview into it? But the reason why I mentioned the communication piece is because it all starts there, and our ability to spread those messages, whether that's through social media, whether that's through mass text programs or something else of the sort, we do have a unique ability to continue to elevate our society forward by using that tool.
I just recently put together a packet of resources for the rising generation, because both at the International Center and in the church, we are really trying to focus more on bringing the younger generation into these conversations about religious freedom and about interfaith understanding. And so I put together this packet and I shared it with our Alliance Council members and some other folks. But it was really surprising to me how many resources are out there. So your question about what tools can people use, there's actually quite a bit of really wonderful curricula that are already out there. If you're interested in teaching sort of the basic principles of religious freedom and the basic principles of interfaith understanding to sort of different levels of education, starting at the primary level, working up to the high school level, working up to the undergraduate and postgraduate levels. So I think those are some really great tools that people can use to teach basic human rights, basic understanding of religious freedom principles, and basic understanding of domestic constitutional issues, as well as international human rights instruments. So that's already out there if you're looking for it, and if you're interested, I can give you that compilation that I've put together. I think there's a variety of other tools that also exist from other nonprofits. I sit on the board of the Religious Freedom Institute, which is a think tank in Washington, D.C. that is really at the cutting edge of religious freedom education and religious freedom policy issues. And they have some really wonderful toolkits for religious organizations in different areas that you can use in this as well. And then I think there also are some tools from other nonprofits out there in this space that are available for not only lawyers, but anyone who's interested in doing sort of religious tolerance work. We are working on one at our International Center right now. We were asked to put together a toolkit for the area legal counsel for our church around the world, and it's more international focused, but I'm hoping that we can also tweak it for domestic focus as well. So there are definitely a lot of resources out there. It's just kind of knowing where to find them.
I hear these answers and I think my brain is broken because I really am thinking about these very differently than these two lovely individuals up here. So I'm thinking about this much bigger picture. So I think that the two tools that are most available, or probably the most helpful, is one, relationships. A lawyer never met a case they don't want to litigate, right? But it's a lot easier when I can pick up the phone based upon a relationship and get something solved for my client short of litigation. And so I love having this guy on speed dial, right? So I can call him and say, hey, I have this issue. Can you point me to the right place to go? So building those relationships. And as a person who has run a campaign, there's no better way for you to build relationships than to go out there and try to get people to vote for you. I'm just putting a plug out there. Okay. The other is a civility. And it's a very strange world that we live in when you act just like a normal, decent human being and people are confused by that because they expect you just to be a jerk to them for no reason. And I think that when you act in a civil way and people believe that you are a civil person, they're also more likely to call you when they need you, and then you build relationships, but are also much more likely to pick up the phone when you call them. And so I think if you couple those two things together, building those relationships and always being civil, even to the folks who are perhaps not as deserving as some other folks of that civility, I think that helps move the ball forward, regardless of whether it's a client issue, whether it's a religious freedom issue or otherwise.
Great. Okay, I'm going to add an audience question in here. It's something that you've all, I think, touched on just a little bit. But the question is, as the U.S. is becoming increasingly polarized politically, and sometimes religious liberty seems like a politically polarized issue, how do you change your conversation and talk about it in a way that prevents it from being so politically polarized? This is for all of you.
So I think two things. Number one is if you come at any problem in a posture of humility, it makes it a lot easier to have the conversation, even a very difficult, polarized conversation. And the other is, I take a lesson, I don't know if any of you watched Ted Lasso on Apple TV, but there's so many great scenes, but the one that I'm thinking of is when he's playing darts. And the lesson is be curious, not judgmental. And so if you come from this place of being curious, asking open-ended questions like you do when you first get a client, you're trying to figure out what is the problem. If you ask those open-ended questions with the goal of obtaining as much information as you can from the other person about what their perspective is so that you can then bridge the gap, I think that's a huge part of it.
So I actually, I recognize the issue of polarization, but I think there's a balance between standing up for religious freedom and doing it in a way that's civilized and appropriate and in a way that doesn't harm relationships, but also doing it, you have to stand up, right? So, we can't shy away from the conflict because it perhaps will make someone feel uncomfortable that we're standing up for our religious freedom rights. So we have to do it in a way that, as we've talked about throughout this conference, is one that maintains relationships, is civil, but also is appropriate to the response, which is we can't just let our religious freedom rights dwindle away because some people want to make us feel uncomfortable that we're standing up for our rights. So I think, the issue of polarization is an important one to be addressed, but I also think we have to not shy away from what needs to be defended just because it might make some people uncomfortable.
Can you repeat the question one more time?
Yes. The question was addressing the idea that religious freedom has become a fairly politically polarized topic, and how do you change your conversation so that it's not inviting political polarization in the U.S.?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm the best person to speak to this because most of what I probably do is polarizing, at least if you look at the news here in Nevada. But I can say that every time I speak to groups, whether that's 5 people or 500 people, it never really devolves into chaos because there's a couple things that always come up. One, and to Hannah's point, normalizing civil discourse is a positive thing. It's not a negative thing. And I think that becomes really, really critical that everything, even if it's covered or projected in a toxic or vexatious kind of manner, doesn't actually need to be when we're having one-on-one conversations. That's the way that growth actually occurs. The second, and when I mentioned earlier with respect to, what's a lawsuit between friends, it actually creates a good ability to drive those types of conversations forward. Because in most of those instances, if those conversations are going to devolve politically and it's just going to be charged, sometimes it's better to put it in briefs, let your opinion be known there. And really, the court is the first, in my opinion, at the forefront, I should say, of what civil discourse should look like. It's not always viewed that way because it's always viewed in a hostile setting. But if your setting is designed to be adversarial and the conversation may be adversarial, having a referee there might not be a bad idea overall. The third thing I'd mention is and I hear this oftentimes, it's sometimes beneficial to not go in there with a my viewpoint is right approach, as Elli had mentioned. And generally, humility in those conversations, and I'm not saying remove one's own personal experiences. Personal experience drives most of us in terms of what we're doing. But the majority of times when things tend to get toxic, there's a trigger point in the conversation where someone says something to offend someone else without knowing that they were doing it. And my experience is it's often been rooted in one's personal experience. We'll be having a dialogue about something. Something may have struck a nerve somewhere during the conversation, and the reaction may change. When the reaction changes, the tone of the conversation flips. And it went from having civil discourse into now we're in an argument, right? And there's a fine line. Argument might be a part of it, but shouldn't be presented in that way. So civility above all things, and patience in the conversations, not interrupting, not interjecting, not talking over someone else. And I think to me the biggest thing oftentimes, and I struggle with this sometimes in my own universe, is a lot of the projections that are given relate to what a moral stance might be. When you've devolved into what's moral and what's not, what's right and what's wrong, you can share the position, but inherently it's subjective. So if your attempt is to win someone over that way, you might be able to convince them of a perspective, but there's no way to actually decipher through that if there's going to be consensus, right? Because it's inherently subjective. So sticking to through those subjects, and again, it might build some level of agreement and understanding, but it's not going to be something where someone walks out saying they won that discussion. It's more so if you walk out thinking you won, you probably lost the person that's on the other end of that conversation.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to sneak one last audience question in, and then we'll move to a little bit of a close. So this is, I think, a pretty pertinent question, and this person raised the idea that there are increasing numbers of people who are not part of organized religion, and they asked, what do we have in common with people who may not believe in organized religion, and what can I remember when I have conversations with them? This is like our lightning round. So give us short and.
So I would, based upon my interfaith work, I will say that if you look at what the spiritual principles of all faiths are, they are basically the same. We don't like people who kill other people or hurt other people, right? We don't like, we like it when people are treated equally. And so if we can focus on those things, they're the same across faiths or no faith. The things that change between the faiths are really you know, am I allowed to eat pork, or am I allowed to drink, or am I allowed to get divorced? Those sort of life things that happen. But the spiritual teachings are basically the same. I will tell you that regardless of your faith, if you can focus on those things, those are like the 10 commandment-y type of things, most faiths are going to, and lack of faith, people are going to be all on the same page on that.
I don't know if I really have anything to add to that one. I think Elli kind of hit it on the head.
Perfect. Okay. So as we finish up here, I'm going to rephrase the question that I have on your on your outline there. Oh, so sorry. So as we finish up, can you end by giving some specific ideas to the people in the audience here for some things that they can do to make a difference, either on the legal front or the policy front, in advancing the cause of religious freedom and human dignity? And let's just go down the line. Let's start with Hannah here.
I think there's just so many great opportunities for lawyers, non-lawyers to facilitate religious freedom and interfaith understanding. I think a great example is what the Egberts have done here in Las Vegas, creating opportunities for civil dialogue, creating opportunities for learning and education, and creating opportunities for interfaith service are really, I think, the three fundamental ways that you can contribute. You don't have to start a nonprofit like the Egberts have to do that, but I think there's just a lot of great ways that you can facilitate both relationships, education, and service. And I think those three things really help the end goal, which is creating those relationships, creating the understanding, and creating the networks that will help in case of a religious freedom issue should arise. Then you have those relationships already built to help resolve those problems. So I think, you shouldn't have to feel like you have to be an expert in these things to start. There are plenty of examples of people who don't have particularly an expertise in religious freedom, but who have just dove in and just started to learn and started to create opportunities for those relationship buildings and educational opportunities and service and through the interfaith lens. So I would just encourage you to just start wherever you are.
Yeah, agree. And I'd also mentioned, reiterate a point I made earlier, reach out to organizations, whether they're legal organizations or not, and offer yourself as a volunteer, potentially. Not on every issue. I'll give an example. We have a case where someone was viciously assaulted. A student was viciously assaulted. There's a lot of issues that came up, and one of the big areas of law in Nevada is personal injury. It might be the biggest area. We sometimes joke that, like, you go to New York, it's funded by Wall Street and Texas Oil, California Tech, Vegas PI, right, all the way. So because of that, though, that was a time where we leaned on PI attorneys to lean into our work. For people of faith who are lawyers, there's a really powerful opportunity to reach out to organizations to offer what your skill set might be that are doing legal work, but also to organizations that are not involved in legal work. You'd be surprised how many of the organizations that you might care about don't have access to a lawyer that might even be able to review their formation paperwork or a contract that they're entering into or helping a senior with their will. And the beauty of it is if you're a lawyer and you have 3 or 4 other folks within your place of worship that you're close with, whether they're attorneys or not, they can help you put those types of programs on. And then it gives them a sense of inclusivity too as they're doing the work, that they're making a difference. I don't know that there's a better profession to be able to make a difference than being a lawyer. And for those of us who are practitioners of faith that are also practitioners of law, that intersection is really, really powerful. And you can help change an entire generation's trajectory, an entire organization, or an entire community without even knowing it, just by reaching out to an organization to offer yourself up as a potential resource when that time comes.
So I think that these community relationships are really important, figuring out what is available in your individual communities, and I think some level of self-reflection and authenticity to yourself as to what would I actually be interested in giving my time and energy and effort to. And it has to be different for everybody. Lending your expertise to groups that might not otherwise have it, I really do. I echo that. I don't know how to write a will. I would never be able to do that. But guess what? I have friends who do, and they might be able to come help my faith community the same way that I can then reach out to their faith communities and offer perspectives based upon my expertise. I think that the last, I lost it. Darn it. It'll come back in a second. Come back to me. Come back.
And the last thing I want to add is I really want to encourage you all to include the rising generation in all of your efforts. I have 3 teenagers and 1 9-year-old, and my sophomore in high school decided recently she wanted to create an interfaith high school group, and so she's really interested in doing this sort of interfaith dialogue with her friends in high school. She's got Muslim friends and Jewish friends and Catholic friends, and I just really think it's important that we not leave the rising generation out of these efforts. We really need to teach them how to disagree civilly. We need to teach them how to understand people who are different from them, and we need to do it in a really meaningful way, because if we don't, all of these efforts will mean nothing because the future will be lost.
She hit it on the head. That's what I was going to say. If you have youth groups, if you have your own children, learning how to have really difficult conversations within a family is really important, because that will help our children have these difficult conversations in their community, and they can only see it if they see it modeled at home.
Well, on behalf of the entire conference, I would like to thank all 3 of you one more time for appearing with us today and sharing your thoughts. Thank you.
Okay, we'll take a 15-minute break, and then we will reconvene for our closing session.